The wedding of Mary and Philip was, for many, the most anticipated event of the year. The church was beautifully decorated with white flowers and golden tones that reflected the soft light of the early afternoon. Friends and family of the couple filled the pews, eager to witness the union of the young couple. But behind all the beauty of the ceremony, there was a tension that only the closest people could perceive. Mary had sensed it since the very first preparations. Her father, George, a simple man who had always worked hard to support her, was deeply emotional. His eyes, which had so often borne the weight of hardships, were shining with pride. He couldn't believe that his daughter, the light of his life, was about to get married. Standing next to Mary, he nervously adjusted the suit he had worked so hard to buy, hoping not to appear out of place in such an elegant setting. George was not a man of great wealth, but to him, his daughter always deserved the world. Philip's parents, Helen and Ernest, on the other hand, were people of great social and financial prestige. Used to moving in the highest circles of society, they viewed their son's marriage to Mary with a certain veiled disdain. Helen, in particular, always questioned whether Mary was suitable for her son. She never said it outright, of course, after all, that would be inappropriate, but her actions spoke louder than her words. Helen was a refined woman, wearing discreet yet extremely expensive jewelry, and carried herself with such poise that it seemed to make everyone around her feel smaller. Her husband, Ernest, shared the same sentiment, though he was less vocal about it. His evaluating glances and the way he adjusted his suit whenever George came close made his opinion perfectly clear. Mary, though deeply in love with Philip, was not unaware of the contempt her future in-laws had for her family, especially for her father. From the beginning of the relationship, she had noticed that Helen and Ernest looked at George as if he were inferior, someone who didn't belong in their world. It hurt her, but she tried to ignore it, focusing on the love she and Philip shared. Philip was different from his parents. He always admired George for his honesty and dedication to his daughter. To him, the fact that George had raised Mary with so much love and effort was something to respect, not to be ashamed of. That morning, as the final preparations were being made and the guests began to arrive, Mary felt a mixture of joy and anxiety. She wanted everything to go well, for the day to be perfect. But something told her that Philip's parents wouldn't let it happen without some tension. Helen, always wearing a fake smile, couldn't hide her discomfort at seeing George so involved in the important moments of the wedding. Ernest remained more distant, but his condescending looks toward George spoke volumes. The church was packed, and the atmosphere was one of celebration but also anticipation. Mary felt her heart beat faster as the wedding hour approached. She glanced at her father, who stood beside her, discreetly wiping away a tear of joy. George was emotional, and it warmed Mary's heart. She knew how much this moment meant to him. He had always supported her in everything, had always been there for her, and now, finally, he was about to give her away to the man she loved. As they waited for the ceremony to begin, Helen and Ernest were surrounded by friends and relatives, all laughing and chatting. Mary, ever attentive, noticed that they looked at George and then exchanged discreet comments. They were laughing at him, mocking his emotional reactions, his simplicity. What was, to Mary, a demonstration of genuine love, was a source of ridicule for her in-laws. Her heart ached, but she took a deep breath. She didn't want anything to ruin that day. Philip noticed the change in Mary's expression and came over, gently holding her hand. "Is everything okay, love?" he asked, with a kind smile. Mary forced a smile back, but the discomfort lingered. "Yes, it's fine," she lied. She didn't want to involve Philip at that moment. She knew he had already argued with his parents several times about the prejudice they had against her family, especially against George. She didn't want to add more tension to their day. But Philip knew Mary well and noticed the unease in her eyes. He glanced at his parents, who were now discreetly laughing at something George had said, and felt a surge of anger rise within him. This wasn't the first time his parents had acted this way, and he knew he would have to confront them again. The church bells rang, and the ceremony began. The moment everyone had been waiting for had arrived. George, proud and with tears in his eyes, walked beside Mary down the aisle. Every step was filled with emotion, and he seemed to struggle to contain the happiness of seeing his daughter get married. At the altar, Philip smiled at Mary, trying to convey reassurance and love. But Mary knew that the tension was still there, even if it was masked by smiles and flowers. She glanced briefly at Helen and Ernest, who maintained their polite expressions, but there was still something in their restrained smiles that made her uncomfortable. The ceremony was beautiful, but Mary couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. With the ceremony concluded and vows exchanged, Mary and Philip were now officially husband and wife. The guests began making their way to the reception hall, where soft music and luxurious decor created the perfect setting for the celebration. Mary, holding George's arm, felt a brief sense of relief as they left the church. At least the ceremony had gone off without a hitch, and now she could relax, or so she hoped. The reception hall was illuminated by soft lights, and the elegantly arranged tables displayed lavish floral arrangements. Waiters circulated among the guests, serving champagne and refined hors d'oeuvres. Everything seemed perfectly coordinated for a grand celebration. George, his eyes still shining with emotion, looked around, admiring the grandeur of the reception. He had never seen anything like it, but he was happy to see his daughter radiant in such a sophisticated setting. Mary, however, couldn't relax. Though she smiled at the guests and tried to enjoy the moment, the unease remained. She felt that at any moment, something could go wrong. And then, it happened. As George approached Philip's parents' table, trying to be polite and greet them, Helen and Ernest exchanged a glance filled with irony. George, unaware of what was happening, made an innocent comment about how wonderful the party was and how grateful he was to be part of such a special moment. His voice was sincere and full of humility. Helen, with a poorly concealed smile, whispered something into Ernest's ear, and they both began to laugh, though they tried to hide it behind their hands. Mary watched from afar, and when she saw the scene, she felt her blood boil. They were mocking her father, a man who had done nothing but love and support her in everything. It was too much to bear. With her heart racing, Mary went to Philip, who was chatting with some friends at a distance, and discreetly pulled him aside. Her voice was trembling with frustration. "Philip, you need to talk to your parents now. They're making fun of my father." Philip, already aware of his parents' prejudice but believing they would behave on the wedding day, became visibly irritated. He knew how much Mary's father meant to her. Looking in the direction of his parents, he saw what was happening. Helen and Ernest were laughing quietly, making gestures with their hands as if imitating George's simple actions. "I'll talk to them," Philip said, his voice firmer than usual. It was his wedding, and he wasn't going to let petty attitudes like those ruin Mary's day. As he walked toward his parents, Philip felt the anger growing. He knew his parents were prejudiced against Mary's humble background, but he didn't expect them to show it so blatantly. When he got close to Helen and Ernest, he saw them quickly try to hide their laughter. "Can you stop this now?" Philip said, his voice low but filled with restrained anger. "This is my wedding, and I won't tolerate you speaking about Mary's father like that." Helen, feigning surprise, raised her eyebrows as if she didn't understand what he meant. "Philip, darling, we're just having fun. There's no need to be so dramatic," she said, with that condescending tone she always used when trying to downplay something. "If you think it's funny to laugh at someone just because they don't come from the same world as you, then you're being cruel." "And cruelty isn't funny," Philip replied, keeping his tone calm but clearly furious. Ernest, who usually remained quiet, decided to intervene. "Come on, son, we're just laughing at a few things," he said. "It's not that serious." He always maintained a conflict-averse posture but couldn't hide the disdain he felt for George. "This is my wedding," Philip responded, trying to keep his frustration in check. "If you can't respect Mary's father, then maybe you shouldn't be at the reception." Helen and Ernest exchanged glances, surprised by their son's firmness. They knew he was serious. Helen tried to deflect. "All right, Philip. We won't mention it again," she said with an artificial smile, picking up her champagne glass, clearly uncomfortable. Philip, though calmer, knew the damage was already done. He looked at Mary, who was watching from afar, and saw that she was still upset. Her father didn't deserve this, and Philip knew the night needed to take a different direction. Meanwhile, unaware of what was happening around him, George, filled with emotion and love for his daughter, made a decision. He approached the stage where the DJ was controlling the sound for the party. With a shy smile, George asked for the microphone. The DJ, surprised and a bit unsure, handed it to George, not knowing what to expect. When Mary saw her father take the microphone, her heart almost stopped. What was he about to do? George, with a trembling but sincere voice, spoke to the guests. "Good evening, everyone. I know I'm not a man of great wealth, nor do I have many riches, but what I do have is the greatest treasure any man can have, the love for my daughter. And today, I want to dedicate a song to her." The entire hall fell silent. All eyes turned to George. Helen and Ernest exchanged glances, while Mary, feeling the emotion rise in her chest, tried to hold back her tears. She didn't know what her father was about to do, but one thing was certain: it would change the course of the night. The reception hall was in complete silence, a stark contrast to the sound of laughter and conversation that had filled the room just minutes before. George stood on stage, holding the microphone with both hands, his eyes gleaming with emotion. The guests watched him, curious and a bit skeptical. What was this simple man, the bride's father, about to do? He had just said he wanted to dedicate a song to his daughter, but no one expected much. After all, he didn't seem like someone who would steal the spotlight at such a sophisticated event. Mary, standing next to Philip, watched her father with a racing heart. She knew how much this moment meant to him, but at the same time, she was apprehensive. The eyes of Helen and Ernest were fixed on George, with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. They said nothing, but their looks said it all: they expected it to be a disaster. George took a deep breath and looked at Mary. There was so much love in his eyes, so much devotion to his daughter, that he seemed to forget any apprehension. The DJ, now more animated, adjusted the microphone and began to play a soft melody in the background. The atmosphere was thick with expectation. Then, George began to sing. And what happened next surprised everyone. George's voice, initially low and almost timid, grew with a strength and emotion that no one expected. He had a deep, rich voice full of feeling that seemed to fill every corner of the hall. Every word of the song was imbued with such pure sincerity that the guests couldn't help but be moved. It was as if every note, every verse, was infused with all the love George felt for Mary. The song was an old ballad, a tune he used to sing to Mary when she was a child, but that night, the lyrics and melody took on a new meaning. The music wasn't just a tribute to his daughter, it was a declaration of everything he had sacrificed, everything he felt for her, and all the pride he had in seeing her happy. As George's voice echoed through the hall, the looks of disdain and skepticism began to transform into admiration. The guests, who had been chatting and laughing before, were now completely absorbed by the performance. Helen and Ernest, who had been mocking him just minutes earlier, were stunned. They exchanged glances, unable to believe what they were hearing. The man they had scorned was moving everyone around him with his powerful voice. Mary was in tears. She had never seen her father like this. She knew he had always been a reserved man, someone who expressed his feelings in simple ways, but now, on that stage, he was bearing his soul for all to see. It was as if, in that moment, he was redeeming himself from all the discrimination he had suffered throughout the wedding preparations. When George reached the final verse of the song, his voice gently faded, and the silence in the hall grew even denser. No one moved. It was as if time had stopped, and everyone was captivated by that magical moment. As he finished, George lowered the microphone, and for a few seconds, the silence continued. People were absorbing what they had just witnessed. Then, a timid applause began from the back of the room. Soon, the entire hall was on its feet, clapping enthusiastically. The guests, who had underestimated George, were now deeply moved. The applause grew louder, and soon everyone was giving him a standing ovation. Mary ran to her father, hugging him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, you were incredible. "I've never been so proud of you," she said, still in disbelief at what had just happened. George, visibly emotional, smiled at his daughter, still at a loss for words. He had never sung expecting recognition. To him, the song was simply a way to express his love for Mary. As the applause continued to echo through the hall, Paul, the sound technician, took the microphone, still visibly emotional. I just have to say something," Paul began, his voice trembling. "Mr. George, that was one of the most sincere and powerful performances I've ever witnessed. I've worked in music for many years, and I can tell you, you have incredible talent." The guests, who had been standing, began to calm down and listen to what Paul was saying. "I know a music producer, and I really believe he needs to hear your voice," Paul continued, still brimming with emotion. "If you're interested, I can introduce you to. I think the world needs to hear what you have to offer." The expressions in the hall shifted from surprise to admiration. This simple man, whom many had underestimated, had just been offered an unexpected opportunity that could change his life. Mary, still holding her father's hand, looked at him in disbelief. George, still speechless, shook his head, clearly surprised by what was happening. He had only gone on stage to pay tribute to his daughter. He never imagined something like this could happen. I don't know what to say," George replied, a little embarrassed but with a smile on his face. "I just wanted to sing for my daughter. I never thought anyone else would want to listen." Paul smiled, as did many of the guests who were visibly moved. Everyone knew that George was not just a simple man, he was an extraordinary man, with a talent that no one could have imagined. "Believe me, Mr. George," Paul said, still smiling. "You have much more to offer than you think." The reception hall still buzzed with the echoes of George's performance. The whispered conversations among the guests revolved around the unexpected performance of the bride's father. For many, it was the most unforgettable moment of the evening, far more so than any speech or the glamour of the ceremony. George, a man so humble and simple, was now the center of attention, something he had never expected. Mary, standing by her father, was still absorbing what had happened. Her eyes shone with pride but also with relief. Finally, her father, who had been the subject of ridicule and disdain for so long, had proven not only that he was worthy of respect but that he was admired by everyone. As the guests applauded and approached to congratulate George, Helen and Ernest remained in their seats, clearly shaken. The laughter and disdain that had once been on their faces were gone. Now, there was something else in their eyes, a mix of surprise, guilt, and perhaps even some discomfort. Ernest was the first to break the silence between them. I didn't know he had that voice," he murmured, still processing what he had witnessed. Helen, who had always maintained a firm and impenetrable posture, was also visibly shaken. She, who had mocked George throughout the wedding, now realized that he possessed something she had never expected, genuine talent, something money couldn't buy. "Neither did I," she replied, her voice lower than usual, as if she were afraid to admit she had underestimated him. "I think, maybe we were wrong about him." Ernest nodded, but there was more to it. He felt ashamed. The two had always been so proud of their wealth and status, believing it put them above others. And now, before all the guests, the man they had scorned had touched everyone's hearts with his music and had been offered an opportunity for success. Meanwhile, Paul, the sound technician, was still talking to George about the proposal to introduce him to the music producer. George's eyes were wide with disbelief as he tried to process the idea that, at his age, he could have a musical career. He had always sung out of love, never expecting anything in return. Mary held her father's hand, full of pride. "Dad, you deserve this. I always knew you had something special, but today, you showed it to the world," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. Philip, who had been watching the scene with a satisfied smile, stepped forward and placed a hand on George's shoulder. "You didn't just move everyone here, George, you also showed that the true value of a person goes far beyond what we see on the outside," he said, glancing at his parents. He knew those words carried special weight, aimed not just at George but especially at Helen and Ernest. The guests began to form a small line to congratulate George, praising his voice and his courage for performing in such a way. Helen watched everything from a distance, not knowing what to do. She was used to being the center of attention, to controlling the narrative at social events, but tonight, everything had changed. And there was no going back. "Do you think we should speak with him?" Ernest asked, breaking the silence between them. Helen hesitated. She had never seen herself as someone who would apologize to someone like George. But in that moment, something inside her made her question her actions. She had always prided herself on being refined, well-mannered, but did that really matter when compared to what George had just done? She took a deep breath. "Yes, I think we should." Helen finally admitted to herself that she had been wrong. Ernest stood up first, and Helen followed. They slowly approached where George, Mary, and Philip were still surrounded by guests. With every step, Helen felt the weight of what she was about to do. She, the woman who had always scorned George, was now going to him, not just to congratulate him but to confront her own arrogance. When they got closer, Philip saw them first. His eyes narrowed for a moment, but then he smiled slightly, as if he had been expecting this. "Mom, Dad," Philip said, his tone calm but full of meaning. "You've come to talk to George?" Helen, feeling the pressure of everyone's eyes on her, took a deep breath. She knew the words she was about to say wouldn't be easy, but they were necessary. "Yes," she replied, her voice now softer but with a sincerity that hadn't been heard in a long time. "George," she began hesitantly, I just wanted to say that your performance was incredible. I never imagined you had that voice. It was moving." George, ever humble, smiled politely. He wasn't used to receiving compliments like that, much less from people like Helen and Ernest. "Thank you," he said, with a simplicity that made Helen feel even smaller. "Actually," Ernest continued, taking over, "I think we owe you an apology. We underestimated you, and that was wrong." George, always with a gentle smile, nodded. "Don't worry about it. Today is Mary and Philip's day. All I wanted was to do something special for them," George replied, without harboring any resentment. Mary watched the scene with a tight heart but also with a sense of relief. Seeing her in-laws acknowledge her father's worth, even if belatedly, meant more than anything. She knew they would never completely change, but this was a first step. After a night full of surprises and emotions, the reception hall began to quiet down. The guests were animatedly discussing what they had just witnessed. Many were still impressed by George's voice, and despite the glamour and sophistication of the entire event, the bride's father's performance was what would be most remembered from the night. However, while everyone celebrated, George found himself in an internal dilemma. He had never sung to be admired. For him, his voice was just a gift for his daughter, something he always used on special occasions. The idea of pursuing a music career, especially at this stage of life, seemed as improbable as it was intimidating. Mary, standing by George's side, held her father's hand, trying to convey strength. She knew that behind his smile, there was an internal struggle. Philip also noticed George's reflective silence. After the emotion of the moment and Helen and Ernest's apologies, reality was beginning to weigh on the bride's father. "Dad," Mary began, her voice soft but firm. "This is a unique opportunity. I know you never expected this, but you deserve it. You've always deserved it." George looked at his daughter, his eyes full of love and pride. He had always dreamed of seeing Mary happy, and now that she was, he felt that his duty as a father had been fulfilled. But something about this offer was unsettling him. He wasn't young anymore, life had passed quickly, and now, on the verge of old age, he wondered if it was still the right time to embark on something so big. "Mary, dear," George said, letting out a deep sigh, "I don't know if this opportunity is for me. I've always sung for you, not for the world. I think that phase of my life has passed." Mary frowned slightly, but she kept her encouraging smile. "Dad," she said tenderly, "I've always admired your humility, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve to be heard by more people. Your music has meaning, and you always said that the important thing is to touch people's hearts." George smiled, remembering the many times he sang to Mary when she was just a little girl, intimate moments between father and daughter, with no one else around. For him, music had always been something private, almost sacred, and the idea of sharing it with the world made him uncomfortable. As George reflected, Paul approached again, with a friendly smile on his face. "Mr. George," he said, respectfully, "I understand that maybe all this happened too fast, but believe me, you have something special, and the world needs to hear it. I've worked in music for many years, and I can guarantee that your talent is rare. There's no age limit to start." George, ever modest, shook his head, unsure of how to respond. He had never been the center of attention, and now, the prospect of being in the spotlight left him with doubts. "I truly appreciate it," George replied, still pondering, "but I've never sought that kind of life. Everything I did was for my daughter. I'm not sure if it's something I should do for myself." Paul nodded, understanding the man's hesitation. He had seen artists go through similar doubts before, but there was something about George, a sincerity and a pure passion, that made him believe this was a golden opportunity. "Well," Paul said, "I understand. But I want you to know that if you change your mind, the offer still stands. The producer I work with has a genuine interest. Think about it carefully. Sometimes, opportunities come when we least expect them." Paul walked away, leaving George once again in silence. Mary remained by his side, but she also knew that this was a decision her father needed to make on his own. Philip placed a hand on George's shoulder and smiled. "You know, George," Philip began, "sometimes we underestimate what we're capable of. I understand that you never sought recognition, but sometimes life puts us in a position where we have the chance to change things, and that can be amazing." George sighed again, looking around the now emptier hall as the last guests began to leave. He was still processing everything that had happened. Mary and Philip's words echoed in his mind, as did Paul's offer. He looked at Mary, and for a moment, he saw his little girl, the one he used to sing lullabies to. Now, she was a grown woman, married, and he knew her life was taking its own course. But what about his life? He had always devoted himself to Mary and never thought much about what he wanted for himself. But now, an unexpected door had opened. Could he cross it? "Dad, no matter what you decide," Mary said, sensing the conflict in her father's eyes, "I will always support you. The important thing is that you do what feels right to you." George smiled, feeling a wave of peace wash over him as he heard those words. The decision didn't need to be made now, but he knew that something inside him was changing. For the first time in many years, he was beginning to think about himself, not just about his daughter. The future seemed uncertain, but one thing he knew, he was no longer afraid to be who he was. The reception hall was almost empty. The last guests were saying their goodbyes, satisfied and still commenting on George's impressive performance. The soft lights created a calm atmosphere, contrasting with the intensity of the previous moments. Mary and Philip's wedding was undoubtedly a success, but George knew that something inside him had changed that night. As they walked toward the exit, Philip and Mary were at his side, holding his hands. Helen and Ernest, though more distant, watched what was happening, perhaps still digesting everything they had seen and felt over the past few hours. George's performance had been a revelation, but Paul's words echoed in everyone's minds. George had a new opportunity, if he wanted it. However, George was still deep in thought. What would this offer mean for him? He had spent his whole life taking care of Mary, giving up his own dreams, but now, with her married and starting a new life, an unexpected door had opened for him. "Dad," Mary said, breaking the silence, "I know this decision is difficult, but whatever you choose, I'll be by your side. I always have been, and I always will be." George looked at his daughter and, for a moment, saw the little girl he used to sing to sleep, the child who ran joyfully around the house and had now grown into a strong and independent woman. He had done everything for her, and Mary had rewarded him with the greatest gift a father could receive, her unconditional love and support. Philip also stepped forward, placing a hand on George's shoulder. "You are amazing, George. Not just today, but every day you spent taking care of Mary and being the father she needed. This opportunity you have now doesn't diminish any of that. In fact, I think it could be a chance for you to finally give yourself the credit you've always deserved." George smiled slightly, but his mind was still spinning with possibilities. He didn't want to seem ungrateful or deluded. The fact that Paul had said a producer was interested was something he could never have imagined. But should he really follow this path? In his 60s, his life had already been established in a certain way. There was a certain comfort and simplicity in the security of routine. But something inside him was nudging him. A soft voice, a feeling that, perhaps, he was about to take a big step into something he had never allowed himself to dream of. It was then that Paul approached once again, this time more discreetly, sensing the weight of George's decision. "Mr. George," he said, "I understand that you have doubts. There's no rush. But I guarantee you that if you decide to move forward, you'll have my support. Music has no age, and you have something rare, something people need to hear. But the decision is yours." George looked at Paul, then at Mary and Philip, and finally, his eyes turned to Helen and Ernest, who were still standing a bit further away. They seemed hesitant, but there was something different about them too. Perhaps, for the first time, Helen and Ernest were realizing that people weren't defined by their social position or wealth, but by their character and talent. George smiled slightly at them. Whatever they thought now, it no longer mattered as much as it once had. George then took a deep breath and turned to Mary. "My dear," he began, his voice firm but emotional, "I've lived my whole life for you. And I don't regret a single moment. You've always been my greatest treasure. But today, I realize that maybe it's time to do something for myself. I think I'm going to give it a try." Mary smiled, her tears shining in her eyes. She knew how important that moment was for her father. He, who had always put others first, was finally making a decision for himself. "Dad, I'm so proud of you," Mary said, hugging him tightly. Philip smiled, proud to see George make his decision. He knew the choice hadn't been easy, but he also knew that George deserved that chance. It was the beginning of something new. Paul, satisfied, shook George's hand and smiled. "Welcome to a new journey, Mr. George," he said enthusiastically. "I guarantee it will be an incredible adventure." Helen and Ernest, who had been watching from a distance, finally approached. Helen, for the first time, seemed more humble, her arrogance gone. "George," she began, I don't know what to say. I think we all learned something today. You were extraordinary. And I wish you all the success in this new journey." Ernest, who had always been more reserved, nodded. "She's right. You surprised us and showed that true talent isn't measured by money or status. We're rooting for you." George smiled at them, acknowledging their effort to admit their mistakes. He knew that change wouldn't be easy for Helen and Ernest, but the fact that they were trying meant a lot. With his decision made and the support of his family, George felt the weight of the world lifted from his shoulders. He was now ready to embark on a new path, with the certainty that, no matter what happened, he had the people he loved by his side. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in many years, George was excited about the possibilities. A few months had passed since Mary and Philip's wedding, and George's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. Paul's offer was the beginning of a new phase. George had begun recording some songs in a small studio, and his voice, which had once been known only to his daughter, was now captivating everyone who heard it. Mary and Philip continued to be his greatest support, always present at every step of this new journey. George, still humble and modest, sometimes wondered how he had gotten there. But the truth was that he wasn't doing it just for himself. He was doing it for all the moments when he had sacrificed his own dreams, for all the times he had put himself second. That day, George was back in the studio, finishing one of the tracks he had started recording. Paul was there, always smiling and encouraging him. As he finished the recording, George looked through the studio glass, where Mary and Philip watched, as proud as ever. George took off his headphones and smiled. The journey was just beginning, but he knew that with his family by his side, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He had finally found his voice, not just the voice that sang, but the voice that said it was time to be who he truly was. And for George, that was the greatest triumph of all. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.